September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal. 800 U.S. Marines faced a tactical nightmare that should have meant certain death. Lieutenant Colonel Red Blake received intelligence that 2,500 Japanese troops were moving through the jungle to surround his position on the ridge south of Henderson Field. Every military manual said the same thing. When outnumbered 3-1 and facing encirclement, you retreat. You find better ground. You call for reinforcements. Blake looked at his Marines, exhausted, low on ammunition, with nowhere to run, and made a decision that defied everything the textbooks taught. He ordered his men to tighten their perimeter. Let the enemy come closer. Let them surround the Marines completely. Through the humid darkness of the Pacific jungle, Japanese forces closed in from three sides, expecting to crush the Americans in a devastating night assault. What happened next would shatter every assumption about defensive warfare and turn a hopeless situation into one of the most lopsided victories in Marine Corps history. The humid air of Guadalcanal's jungle pressed against the Marines like a living thing as darkness settled over the ridge on September 13. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Blake moved through his defensive positions with the measured steps of a man who had already accepted the mathematics of death. 800 Marines. 2,500 Japanese troops confirmed moving through the jungle below. The numbers didn't lie, but Blake had learned long ago that numbers rarely told the complete story. The ridge itself was barely worthy of the name. A low spine of coral and volcanic rock that rose perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding jungle, stretching roughly 1,000 yards in a north-south direction. To military strategists studying maps in Washington, it appeared insignificant. To the Marines digging in along its slopes, it represented the thin line between American control of Henderson Field and complete disaster in the Pacific. The airstrip lay just 800 yards to the north, close enough that they could hear the occasional drone of aircraft engines starting up in the pre-dawn darkness. Blake had positioned his forces with the calculated precision of a chess master playing for his life. The 1st Raider Battalion held the northern section of the ridge closest to Henderson Field, while the 1st Parachute Battalion stretched along the southern approaches. Between them, they commanded overlapping fields of fire across the jungle approaches. But Blake knew that firepower alone wouldn't save them. The Japanese had proven time and again that they would absorb horrific casualties to achieve their objectives, and Major General Takashi Yamamoto had 3 times their numbers moving through the darkness. The Marines had been fighting on Guadalcanal for over a month, and the jungle had already taught them lessons that no training manual could convey. The oppressive humidity turned every piece of metal scorching hot during the day, and slick with condensation at night. Canvas rotted within weeks, food spoiled within days. Men lost weight they couldn't afford to lose, and developed tropical diseases that sapped their strength. But they had also learned to use the jungle's peculiar acoustics to their advantage, listening for the subtle sounds that betrayed enemy movement through the dense undergrowth. As Blake checked his positions, he found Gunnery Sergeant Frank Romano adjusting the traverse mechanism on his Browning M1917 machine gun. The weapon was a relic from the previous war, water-cooled and weighing 41 pounds without its tripod, but it could sustain a rate of fire that would shred human flesh at ranges up to 500 yd. Romano had already proven his worth in previous engagements, displaying the kind of steady competence under fire that separated seasoned Marines from the replacements still arriving from the States. "How's your ammunition situation, Gunny?" Blake asked, crouching beside the machine gun position. "Enough to make them think twice about coming up this hill, Colonel." Romano replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that Blake had learned to rely upon. "Though I wouldn't mind having a few more belts if the Japanese decide to get serious about this." Private First Class David Mitchell was dug in 20 yards to Romano's left. His Springfield rifle cleaned and loaded, bayonet fixed. The young Marine had arrived on Guadalcanal barely 3 weeks earlier, still carrying the soft look of stateside training camps, but the jungle had already begun its transformation. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and his eyes held the particular alertness that came from knowing that death could arrive without warning from any direction. The Japanese strategy, as Blake understood it from intelligence reports and captured documents, relied on speed and shock. Yamamoto's forces had been moving through the jungle for 3 days, following trails that only the most experienced guides could navigate in daylight. Their plan called for a coordinated night assault from 3 directions designed to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and the psychological impact of fighting in complete darkness. What the Japanese hadn't anticipated was the defensive preparation that Blake had implemented over the previous week. Every approach to the ridge had been studied, measured, and pre-registered for artillery fire. The Marines had cleared fields of fire through the jungle undergrowth, creating killing zones that would channel attacking forces into predetermined corridors. Wire obstacles, though limited by supply shortages, had been positioned to slow and funnel enemy troops into the most effective engagement ranges. The Marines also possessed advantages that wouldn't appear on any intelligence report that Yamamoto might have received. Their training emphasized individual initiative and adaptability, characteristics that proved invaluable in the chaos of night combat. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, who relied heavily on coordinated group tactics, American Marines were taught to fight effectively as individuals when larger formations broke down under fire. As the night deepened, the sounds of the jungle began to change. The normal chorus of insects and nocturnal animals gradually gave way to an unnatural silence that every experienced Marine recognized as the prelude to contact. Somewhere in the darkness below the ridge, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving into position, their presence creating a disturbance that even the jungle wildlife could sense. Blake made his final rounds through the defensive positions, speaking quietly with squad leaders and checking ammunition supplies. The Marines had approximately 200 rounds per rifleman, supplemented by grenades, mortars, and the machine guns that would serve as the backbone of their defense. It wasn't an abundance, but it was sufficient for men who had learned to make every shot count. The colonel's radio crackled with reports from observation posts scattered through the jungle. Japanese forces had been spotted moving along 3 separate approaches, confirming the intelligence estimates of a multi-pronged assault. The enemy was close enough now that individual voices could occasionally be heard through the undergrowth, speaking in the clipped syllables of Japanese military commands. At 11:45, the first Japanese mortar rounds began falling on the ridge. The explosions were scattered and poorly coordinated, suggesting that Yamamoto's forces were still moving into position and attempting to register their indirect fire weapons. But the shelling served its intended psychological purpose, announcing to the Marines that the battle they had been expecting was finally about to begin. Blake took his position at the command post, a shallow depression protected by sandbags and located at the highest point of the ridge. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire length of his defensive line and maintain radio contact with Henderson Field. The Air Strip's artillery batteries were standing by to provide support. Their guns already loaded and trained on predetermined target areas. The jungle erupted into chaos as the first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the Trian, their battle cries echoing across the ridge as they charged toward the Marine positions. The real test was about to begin. The first wave of Japanese infantry broke from the jungle like a human avalanche. Their voices raised in the traditional banzai cry that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific. But as they charged up the slopes of the ridge, they encountered something that Major General Yamamoto had not anticipated in his tactical planning. The Marines didn't break. They didn't retreat. Instead, they opened fire with a disciplined precision that turned the hillside into a slaughter zone. Romano's machine gun began its deadly work at 800 yards. The heavy slugs from the Browning cutting through the advancing Japanese like a scythe through wheat. The weapon's water-cooled barrel allowed for sustained fire that bolt-action rifles simply couldn't match, and Romano had positioned his gun to annihilate the primary approach route. Each burst sent 5 to 7 rounds downrange in less than 2 seconds. And at this range, every round that found its mark was lethal. The Japanese assault had been planned according to traditional infantry doctrine that emphasized speed and shock action. Yamamoto's forces were expected to close the distance to American positions quickly, using darkness and overwhelming numbers to compensate for their limited firepower. But the ridge's terrain worked against them in ways that no amount of pre-battle reconnaissance could have revealed. The Marines had spent weeks studying every approach, every fold in the ground, every piece of cover that an attacking force might use. Private Mitchell sighted down his Springfield rifle and squeezed the trigger, watching a Japanese soldier stumble and fall 50 yards down slope from his position. The young Marine worked the bolt action smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round with the mechanical efficiency that months of training had drilled into his muscle memory. Around him, the distinctive crack of American rifles created a steady percussion that punctuated the deeper roar of the machine guns. What Yamamoto had fundamentally misunderstood was the nature of American defensive doctrine. Japanese military thinking emphasized the spiritual superiority of the attack. The belief that determined infantry could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. American doctrine, by contrast, focused on maximizing firepower and creating interlocking fields of fire that would destroy attacking forces before they could close to effective range. The Marines had turned the ridge into a fortress designed to exploit every advantage that modern weapons could provide. The Japanese forces advancing up the southern approaches encountered their first devastating surprise when American mortar rounds began falling among their ranks. The Marines had pre-plotted every likely avenue of approach, measuring distances and calculating firing solutions during daylight hours when they could work without fear of enemy observation. Now in the darkness, those calculations paid dividends as high explosive shells detonated with lethal precision among the closely packed Japanese infantry. Corporal Nakamura led his squad through the undergrowth, desperately seeking cover as American bullets winded overhead and mortar fragments whistled through the jungle canopy. The veteran non-commissioned officer had participated in successful night assaults across the Pacific. But this was different. The American fire was too accurate, too sustained, too well coordinated to be the product of panicked defenders firing wildly into the darkness. These Marines were shooting with purpose, and Japanese soldiers were dying faster than they could advance. The tactical reality that Yamamoto was only beginning to understand became clear as his second wave emerged from the jungle to find the ground ahead of them littered with the bodies of their comrades. The Marines had not only stopped the first assault, but had done so with such devastating efficiency that the attacking forces were already losing cohesion. Japanese squad and platoon leaders, the experienced non-commissioned officers who held their units together in combat, were being systematically eliminated by American marksmen who had learned to identify targets of opportunity in the muzzle flashes and movement patterns of the attacking infantry. Blake monitored the battle from his command position, receiving reports from his subordinate commanders and calling in artillery support from Henderson Field. The colonel understood that this was more than just another Japanese probe. Yamamoto had committed significant forces to this assault, and the enemy's persistence suggested that they viewed the ridge as a critical objective. But Blake also recognized that the Japanese were making fundamental errors in their approach. Errors that his Marines were trained and equipped to exploit. The American artillery batteries at Henderson Field had been registered on predetermined target areas around the ridge. And now those guns began speaking with devastating effect. The 155mm howitzers could deliver high explosive shells with surgical precision, guided by forward observers who had maintained communication with the gun crews throughout the preliminary bombardment. Each shell created a lethal radius of fragmentation that could incapacitate enemy infantry across a 40-yard area, and the guns were firing at a rate of 4 rounds per minute. Japanese tactics called for infiltration and close assault, but the terrain around the ridge offered limited concealment for large formations. The Marines had cleared fields of fire that extended 300 yards in every direction, creating killing zones where attacking forces would be exposed to concentrated fire from multiple positions. Even in darkness, the muzzle flashes from Japanese weapons revealed their positions to American gunners who had been trained to engage targets by sound and flash signature. The third Japanese assault wave encountered an even more sophisticated defense as Blake began implementing tactics that would become standard doctrine for American forces throughout the Pacific War. Rather than simply holding static positions, Marine squads began executing limited counterattacks designed to disrupt Japanese formations before they could organize for coordinated assaults. These small unit actions led by experienced non-commissioned officers like Romano prevented the enemy from establishing firing positions within effective range of the ridge. Yamamoto's forces found themselves caught in a tactical nightmare that their training had not prepared them to handle. The Americans were not behaving according to the patterns that Japanese intelligence had identified in previous engagements. Instead of falling back under pressure or breaking when subjected to determined assault, the Marines were fighting with a professional competence that turned every Japanese advantage into a liability. The sustained rate of fire that American weapons could maintain proved decisive as the battle entered its second hour. Japanese infantry armed primarily with bolt-action rifles found themselves outgunned by Marines who possessed not only superior firepower but also the tactical training to employ that firepower effectively. The Browning machine guns supported by mortars and artillery created an interlocking network of destruction that no amount of individual courage could overcome. By midnight, Yamamoto's assault had lost all momentum. His forces scattered and disorganized across the jungle approaches to the ridge. The general faced a choice that would define the remainder of the battle. Continue feeding his remaining forces into what had become a killing field, or acknowledge that his initial strategy had failed and attempt to develop new tactics for dealing with an enemy who refused to conform to Japanese expectations of American fighting ability. The jungle fell into an eerie silence as the fourth Japanese assault wave dissolved into scattered groups of survivors crawling back through the undergrowth. Yamamoto had committed over 1,500 men to the attacks and the ridge remained firmly in American hands, but the general was far from finished. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14, he prepared to stake everything on a final coordinated assault that would either break the Marine defense or destroy what remained of his command. Blake moved through his positions, assessing ammunition supplies and redistributing his forces to cover the gaps that 4 hours of continuous combat had opened in his defensive line. The Marines had performed magnificently, but they were showing the strain of sustained action. Private Mitchell had fired over 100 rounds from his Springfield, more ammunition than many Marines expended in an entire month of training. His shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and his hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his 8-round clips by feel in the darkness. The colonel's biggest concern was ammunition for the machine guns. Romano's crew had fired nearly 3,000 rounds, changing barrels twice to prevent overheating, despite the weapon's water-cooled design. The gunny sergeant reported that he had perhaps 500 rounds remaining, enough for another sustained engagement, but not sufficient for a prolonged battle. Similar reports came from the other machine gun positions scattered along the ridge, each crew rationing their remaining ammunition while maintaining their sectors of fire. Yamamoto had learned from his earlier failures, and his final assault reflected a more sophisticated understanding of American defensive capabilities. Instead of launching mass frontal attacks that played to Marine strengths, he divided his remaining forces into smaller infiltration groups tasked with penetrating the American perimeter and attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Japanese would sacrifice the psychological impact of bonsai charges in favor of tactics that might actually succeed against disciplined defenders. The new Japanese approach became apparent when Marine listening posts began reporting movement from sectors that had been quiet during the earlier assaults. Small groups of enemy soldiers were attempting to work their way around the flanks of the American position, using ravines and dense vegetation to mask their approach. These infiltrators carried light weapons and grenades, planning to get close enough to the Marine positions to neutralize key weapons like machine guns and mortars through surprise attacks. Blake responded by pulling his reserve forces from their positions behind the main defensive line and deploying them to counter the infiltration attempts. These were his most experienced Marines, men who had proven their ability to fight effectively in small groups without direct supervision. They moved through the jungle with the silent efficiency of hunters, using their knowledge of the terrain to intercept Japanese forces before they could reach the ridge. The fighting that ensued was unlike anything in the previous assaults. Individual Marines found themselves engaged in close-quarters combat with Japanese soldiers who had penetrated to within 30 yards of key defensive positions. Mitchell heard movement in the undergrowth to his left and turned to see a Japanese infiltrator rising from concealment with a grenade in his hand. The young Marine's rifle cracked once and the enemy soldier collapsed, the grenade rolling harmlessly down the slope to explode among the trees below. Romano's position came under direct attack when a Japanese squad managed to approach within grenade range of his machine gun. The gunny sergeant and his crew fought with pistols and rifle stocks as enemy soldiers attempted to storm their sandbag emplacement. One Japanese soldier actually reached the machine gun before Romano killed him with a burst from his personal Thompson submachine gun. The dead man's body falling across the weapon's tripod. The intensity of the close combat created chaos along the defensive perimeter, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness in Yamamoto's new strategy. By dispersing his forces into small infiltration groups, the general had sacrificed the mass and momentum that were essential for breakthrough operations. Instead of concentrating his remaining strength against a single point in the American line, he had spread his forces across multiple objectives, allowing the Marines to defeat each group in detail. American artillery continued to play a decisive role, but now the guns were firing at targets identified by forward observers who were sometimes only yards away from enemy positions. The proximity of combatants made fire missions extremely dangerous, requiring split-second timing and precise navigation to avoid hitting friendly forces. Shell bursts illuminated the jungle in brief hellish glimpses that revealed Japanese soldiers desperately seeking cover among the twisted roots and fallen logs. The tactical situation had evolved into exactly the kind of fighting that favored American training and equipment. Marines excelled at small unit actions that required individual initiative and adaptability. Their weapons were designed for sustained fire and close-range accuracy. Most importantly, their doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks that prevented enemy forces from consolidating gains or establishing firing positions. As dawn approached, the character of the battle changed once again. Yamamoto's infiltration tactics had failed to achieve breakthrough, and daylight would expose his remaining forces to devastating fire from American positions that commanded excellent fields of observation. The general faced the prospect of continuing his attacks in broad daylight against defenders who had already proven their ability to inflict catastrophic casualties on his forces. The Japanese began withdrawing shortly after 5 in the morning. Their movement covered by mortar fire that was poorly coordinated and largely ineffective. Marine observers watched through field glasses as scattered groups of enemy soldiers retreated through the jungle, leaving behind equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the killing ground around the ridge. Blake ordered his forces to maintain their positions and avoid pursuit operations that might expose them to ambush or lead them into prepared enemy positions. The colonel understood that his primary mission was defensive, and he had achieved that mission with a tactical victory that exceeded all reasonable expectations. His 800 Marines had not only held their ground against overwhelming odds, but had virtually destroyed an enemy force 3 times their size. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of the Japanese defeat. Reconnaissance patrols counted over 700 enemy bodies on the approaches to the ridge, with many more wounded soldiers evacuated during the retreat. American casualties numbered fewer than 50 killed and wounded, a ratio that would have seemed impossible to military analysts studying the preliminary force dispositions. Yamamoto's failure at the ridge effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities on Guadalcanal and marked the beginning of a strategic shift that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The I Marines had demonstrated that disciplined defenders with superior firepower could defeat numerically superior attackers regardless of their reputation for fanatical courage. More importantly, they had shown that American forces could adapt their tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses while maximizing their own technological and training advantages. The ridge that would forever bear Blake's name had become the graveyard of Japanese hopes for victory on Guadalcanal, and the 800 Marines who held it had proven that superior numbers meant nothing against superior preparation, training, and leadership. The first rays of dawn painted the jungle canopy in shades of gold and green as Blake surveyed the battlefield that stretched below the ridge. What he saw defied every prediction that staff officers had made about Japanese resilience and fighting capability. Bodies lay scattered across the approaches in groupings that told the story of each failed assault, their positions marking the high watermark of what had been one of the most concentrated enemy offensives in the Pacific War. The silence that had settled over the ridge carried an almost supernatural quality, broken only by the distant calls of tropical birds resuming their morning routines. Private Mitchell emerged from his fighting position for the first time in 6 hours, his legs unsteady beneath him as circulation returned to limbs that had remained cramped in the same defensive posture throughout the night. The young Marine looked out across the killing field with the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had witnessed industrialized death on a scale that no training exercise could simulate. Japanese equipment lay abandoned among the bodies, rifles with their distinctive long bayonets, light mortars that had never found their range, and canvas packs spilling personal effects across the jungle floor. Romano supervised the cleaning of his machine gun, running patches through the barrel to remove the carbon fouling that accumulated after firing nearly 4,000 rounds. The weapon had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, its water-cooled design preventing the overheating that would have rendered it useless during the most critical phases of the battle. But the gunny sergeant understood that mechanical reliability meant nothing without the tactical skill to employ weapons effectively. And he had proven that American machine gun doctrine could devastate attacking infantry when properly implemented. The scale of Japanese losses became apparent as Marine patrols began moving through the battlefield to collect intelligence and assess enemy casualties. Yamamoto had committed the equivalent of 3 full battalions to his assault on the ridge, approximately 2,500 men, representing some of his most experienced combat units. Of these, fewer than 800 remained capable of organized resistance, and many of those were wounded or separated from their parent units during the chaotic retreat. What made the defeat particularly devastating for Japanese strategic planning was the quality of the forces that had been destroyed. These were not raw recruits or second-line garrison troops, but veteran infantry who had participated in successful campaigns across the Pacific. Many of Yamamoto's soldiers had fought in the conquest of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, gaining combat experience that Japanese planners considered essential for offensive operations against American forces. The loss of such experienced personnel represented a blow to Japanese military capability that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Guadalcanal. Blake's tactical victory had implications that reached into the highest levels of military strategy on both sides of the Pacific conflict. For the Americans, the successful defense of the ridge demonstrated that Japanese forces weren't invincible, that superior numbers and fanatical determination could be overcome through professional competence and effective use of firepower. This lesson would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the war, encouraging commanders to trust in their training and equipment when facing seemingly impossible odds. The Japanese response to the defeat revealed fundamental weaknesses in their strategic thinking that had been masked by earlier victories against less prepared opponents. Yamamoto's after-action reports blamed his failure on inadequate artillery support and insufficient time for reconnaissance. But these explanations avoided addressing the core problem. Japanese infantry tactics had been designed for campaigns against opponents who lacked the firepower and tactical sophistication of American Marine units. And no amount of additional preparation would have overcome these doctrinal limitations. American intelligence officers who interrogated captured Japanese soldiers discovered that Yamamoto's forces had been told to expect minimal resistance from demoralized American defenders who would collapse under determined assault. This fundamental misreading of Marine capabilities reflected broader Japanese misconceptions about American fighting ability that would prove costly throughout the Pacific War. The notion that Western soldiers lacked the spiritual strength for sustained combat had been disproven in the most decisive manner possible. The strategic consequences of the battle extended beyond immediate military considerations to affect the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. Henderson Field remained in American hands, providing a base for air operations that would gradually strangle Japanese supply lines to their remaining forces on Guadalcanal. Without the ability to reinforce or resupply their positions, Japanese commanders faced the prospect of conducting a defensive campaign with inadequate resources against an enemy who controlled both the sea approaches and the airspace over the island. For the Marines who had fought on the ridge, the victory provided validation of training methods and tactical doctrines that many had questioned during their months of preparation in the United States. The emphasis on individual marksmanship, small unit tactics, and aggressive use of supporting weapons had proven effective against an enemy renowned for military prowess. More importantly, they had demonstrated to themselves and to observers throughout the Pacific that American forces could not only match Japanese combat effectiveness, but could exceed it when properly led and equipped. The human cost of the victory, while relatively light by the standards of Pacific warfare, still represented irreplaceable losses for units that had no immediate prospect of receiving replacements. 43 Marines had been killed during the engagement with another 97 wounded seriously enough to require medical evacuation. Each casualty represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced, highlighting the importance of tactical victories that achieve strategic objectives while minimizing friendly losses. Blake's personal leadership during the battle became a case study in small unit command that would be analyzed and emulated throughout the Marine Corps for decades to follow. His decision to allow Japanese forces to surround his position had seemed like tactical suicide to observers who lacked understanding of the defensive advantages that the ridge provided. By forcing the enemy to attack uphill against prepared positions, he had maximized the effectiveness of American firepower while minimizing Japanese advantages in numbers and close combat proficiency. The ridge that would bear Blake's name represented more than just another tactical victory in the long struggle for control of the Pacific. It marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in the balance of military effectiveness that would characterize the remainder of the war against Japan. American forces had proven that superior training, equipment, and leadership could overcome any advantage in numbers or fighting spirit that their enemies might possess. The lesson learned in the jungles of Guadalcanal would echo across every battlefield from the Solomon Islands to the shores of Japan itself, carried forward by Marines who had witnessed the birth of American tactical supremacy in the Pacific theater of operations. The radio reports flowing into Japanese headquarters throughout the morning of September 14 painted a picture that Yamamoto could barely comprehend. His brigade, which had numbered over 3,000 men when it departed its staging areas just days earlier, had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Unit commanders who had maintained contact reported casualties exceeding 60%, with many companies reduced to fewer than 20 effective soldiers. The 35th Infantry Brigade, once considered among the most capable formations in the Imperial Japanese Army, had been shattered against the ridge in a single night of fighting. The survivors of the assault straggled through the jungle in small groups, many carrying wounded comrades who slowed their retreat and made them vulnerable to American pursuit. Japanese military doctrine had never adequately addressed the logistics of large-scale withdrawals, assuming that victory or death were the only acceptable outcomes for imperial forces. Now, Yamamoto faced the unprecedented challenge of evacuating what remained of his command while maintaining enough organizational structure to prevent complete collapse. Captain Tanaka, one of Yamamoto's few remaining company commanders, had witnessed the final assault from a forward observation position that provided clear views of the American defensive line. His report to brigade headquarters described Marine positions that maintained disciplined fire even as Japanese soldiers closed to within 20 yards of their fighting holes. The Americans, Tanaka noted, never seemed to panic or lose tactical cohesion, responding to each Japanese thrust with coordinated counter-fire that eliminated attackers with mechanical precision. American intelligence officers monitoring Japanese radio communications detected the growing desperation in enemy transmissions as unit commanders attempted to account for their scattered forces. The intercepts revealed that Yamamoto had lost contact with over half his subordinate units, many of which had been destroyed so completely that no survivors remained to report their fate. Those units that did maintain communication painted a consistent picture of devastating losses and complete tactical failure. The impact of the defeat extended far beyond the immediate battlefield to affect Japanese strategic planning throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. High Command had committed Yamamoto's brigade as the spearhead of a larger offensive designed to recapture Henderson Field and eliminate American air power in the region. The failure of this assault forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Japanese capabilities and revealed that American defensive strength had been dramatically underestimated by Tokyo's military planners. For the Marines on the ridge, the magnitude of their victory became clear as patrols returned with reports of enemy equipment and casualties scattered across several square miles of jungle. The sheer volume of abandoned Japanese material told the story of an army in full retreat, rifles discarded to speed withdrawal, mortars left behind when their crews were killed or wounded, and personal equipment scattered along every trail leading away from the battlefield. Intelligence specialists cataloged the captured weapons and documents, building a comprehensive picture of Japanese tactical organization and equipment that would prove invaluable in future engagements. Private Mitchell accompanied one of the reconnaissance patrols that ventured beyond the immediate perimeter to assess the extent of Japanese losses. What he saw during that patrol would remain burned into his memory for the remainder of his life. Bodies of enemy soldiers lay in positions that revealed the story of each failed assault. Their equipment and weapons scattered in patterns that indicated the intensity of American defensive fire. Many Japanese positions showed evidence of direct hits from artillery or mortar rounds, with entire squads eliminated in single explosions that left craters surrounded by debris and human remains. Romano supervised the redistribution of ammunition from Japanese sources, examining captured rifles and machine guns to assess their capabilities and potential battlefield applications. The Japanese weapons showed excellent craftsmanship, but revealed design philosophies that differed significantly from American approaches. Where American weapons emphasized sustained fire and mechanical reliability, Japanese designs prioritized accuracy and conservation of ammunition, reflecting different tactical doctrines and manufacturing capabilities. The strategic implications of the battle resonated through both military hierarchies as senior commanders attempted to understand what had occurred on the ridge. American generals saw validation of training programs and tactical doctrines that had been developed during peacetime but never tested under combat conditions. The emphasis on small unit leadership, individual marksmanship, and coordinated use of supporting weapons had proven devastatingly effective against an enemy renowned for military competence. Japanese military leaders faced the more difficult task of explaining how elite infantry units had been destroyed by a numerically inferior enemy fighting from prepared positions. Traditional Japanese military thinking emphasized spiritual strength and aggressive tactics as the keys to victory, concepts that had proven inadequate against American firepower and defensive expertise. The defeat forced painful recognition that technological superiority and professional training could overcome advantages in numbers and fighting spirit. Yamamoto's personal fate illustrated the broader consequences of the tactical disaster. The general who had enjoyed a reputation as one of Japan's most capable field commanders found his career effectively ended by the failure on Guadalcanal. His superiors in Tokyo viewed the defeat as evidence of inadequate leadership and poor tactical judgment, criticisms that ignored the fundamental problems with Japanese doctrine and strategic assessment that had made the disaster inevitable. The medical aftermath of the battle revealed additional dimensions of the Japanese defeat. American corpsmen treating wounded prisoners discovered that many enemy soldiers suffered from malnutrition and tropical diseases that had significantly reduced their combat effectiveness. The Japanese logistical system stretched to its limits by extended supply lines, and American air attacks had proven incapable of maintaining fighting units at full strength during prolonged campaigns in hostile environments. American casualties, while tragic for the families and units involved, represented a remarkably favorable exchange ratio that validated tactical decisions made throughout the engagement. The 43 Marines killed and 97 wounded had inflicted losses on Japanese forces that exceeded 20-1, a ratio that reflected both the defensive advantages of the ridge and the superior effectiveness of American weapons and tactics. The political ramifications of the victory extended beyond military considerations to affect American morale and Japanese strategic calculations throughout the Pacific. News of the successful defense reached the United States at a time when public opinion remained uncertain about American prospects in the Pacific War. The Marine victory provided concrete evidence that Japanese forces could be defeated through superior preparation and professional competence, encouraging continued support for the massive military expansion that would ultimately prove decisive. The ridge that had witnessed this transformation in Pacific warfare stood silent in the afternoon heat. Its slopes marked by the debris of battle, but no longer contested by opposing forces. For the 800 Marines who had held this ground against overwhelming odds, the victory represented validation of everything they had been taught about warfare, leadership, and the power of disciplined soldiers fighting for a cause they understood and supported.